A pleasant good morning to everyone, and thank you, Dr. Walk, for inviting me to share some of the research we would have done around using heavy mineral stratigraphy to elucidate some of the geological problems we have around Northern South America. My name is Hayes Vincent, and several years ago, I was a PhD student at DAL, sitting in that very same classroom where you were at, learning a lot about sandstones and mineralogy, and two, participating in the very class as a tutor, a part-time tutor. So it's my pleasure to be back here once again. So if you bear with me for the next few moments or so, I hope that the example that I can share around, as the title says, using heavy minerals and the trital composition of sandstones to deduce the uplift history across the Northeast South American margin. I hope that will help in helping you to understand some of what you may have seen in theory around the use of heavy mineral stratigraphy. So let's begin the story with where we are. The inset map to the left shows the continent of South America, and you can see in the rectangular box we are at the very northern end or the edge of the continent. Also on the map you can see the location of Trinidad. Trinidad located in a very interesting position. To the west of Trinidad you see a number of faults. It's a very active, deformed margin, again demarcated by a number of compressional and extensional faults. Whereas to the southeast of Trinidad you see labeled a passive continental margin. Now what that means simply is it's relatively less deformed relative to what occurs to the west. So this location of Trinidad between this western deformed and southeastern very passive continental margin is very interesting, and really you will see the significance of that as we develop the story. For that transition from passive or from active into passive is actually recorded in the sandstone compositions. Other things of note on this particular map, you see to the north the Lesser Antilles island arc. You see islands such as Grenada, Barbados being represented. To the south we have the craton, the South American craton. So you recognize the Guyana Shield, which is one of the major cratons in the South American continent. You see the Llanos Basin, which is really a large floodplain traversed by the Orinoco River. That lies between these very old shield rocks and the Merida Andes, which is a fairly young uplift of the Andean mountain belt. So quickly, let me give a brief outline of the upcoming slides. So we just spoke a little bit about the regional setting, keep in mind the difference between the active and the passive continental setting. In the next slide, we will talk a little bit about what was the scientific problem we were trying to solve. Basically, the answer is the uplift history of the margin. I will also talk a little bit about the methodology that was employed. No secrets here. It's the heavy minerals, and I will talk a little bit also about generally QFL plots, quartz feldspar lithic plots, which really refers to the lighter sandstone fraction. And then lastly, I would summarize by talking or coming back to how we recognize or how we interpret the margin evolution from the use of heavy minerals and QFL plots. So bear with me a bit. So what is the academic question that we're trying to solve? And really it pertains to when the Trinidad transitioned from a more passive continental margin into a zone of very active deformation, as we see occurring towards the west. And the hypothesis that we employed for our study was that that transition from a passive continental margin is actually reflected within the sandstone bodies that are present across the region. So what is shown here is a summary stratigraphic table for the Trinidad area. Our story begins in the Cretaceous, roughly about 70 million years ago, the end of the Cretaceous, and continues up into the Cenozoic. So each of the polygons that are shown here represents a sandstone unit that was sampled for heavy mineral and petrographic analysis. So just to summarize a really high level, we have a Cretaceous suite represented by the Kush and Naparima Hill formations. Then we transition into a Paleogene suite, Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene suite, which starts with the Chaudier formation, continues with and ends with, say, the River formation. And then finally we have what I will call a Neogene suite, which really represents strong deltaic input, deltaic sandstones of, say, the lower Cruz and Mont Lefort formations. Now, to summarize the story, here I have listed very quickly the petroleum system. I wouldn't get into those details, but to summarize the academic question that we're trying to answer is, I will use these two polygons. So again, passive margin demonstrated in the yellow polygon, and the question one is, did that transition to an active continental margin occur somewhere within, at the end of the Cretaceous into the Paleogene? Another school of thought is that that transition actually occurred around the Nerva formation, which will be the end of the Oligocene. Now, what we will do is look at the sandstone record to see if we can better define when that transition really took place. So the results that we are about to show really form part of a much larger integrated study that involved one, largely petrology, as shown here, a bit of petrographic analysis, heavy mineral analyses. Sedimentology was a big part of this, looking for relationships, lithofacious relationships between the different rock types. The study of ichnofabrics, also ichnofacies. We also collected quite a number of samples, and the results of the studies of those samples, some of them are being shown today. And then lastly, we try to integrate a little bit of nanofossils and foraminifera into the results. But today, what we'll be focusing on would be the heavy mineral grain counts and a little bit on the quartz feldspar lithic framework relationships. So one of the things that I commonly say is that mineralogy cannot lie. As you know, we use the mineralogy of rocks in all fields of study. So metamorphic rocks, igneous petrology, as well as sedimentary rocks. We study the mineralogy to deduce or to understand the geological history that particular rock suite would have experienced. It's really no different in this particular case. The mineralogy of sandstone rocks are really determined, one, by the composition of the parent rock from which it was eroded. That's a key factor, key attribute. Secondly, it's also determined by the relative rates of mechanical and or chemical weathering. And in particular, in northern South America, with extremely high rates of high temperatures, high rates of mechanical weathering, chemical weathering tends to be the dominant determinant on your sandstone compositions. So considering the parent rock from which these sandstones originate, let's use this map to summarize some of these major domains. So to the west, we have the Andean mountain belt. The Andean mountain belt, you would appreciate, is a very young mountain belt characterized by very high rates of erosion. Towards the east, I previously mentioned the Guyana Shield, cratonic belt characterized by very slow rates of erosion, but very intense chemical weathering, producing a very mature suite of rocks. And then in between, or towards the middle, we have this very broad plain, relatively flat plain, called the Llanos Basin. That is actually the flood plain for the Orinoco River, which you can see debouches, or the mouth of the river lies just south of Trinidad, and really determining the composition of sandstones that are now part of the uplifted Trinidad belt. These different domains are associated with very different suites of clastic sediments. The Andean belt, high rates of erosion characterized by abundant lithic fractions, or abundant lithic fragments within your sandstones. The Guyana Shield, very mature province characterized by abundant quartz, even feldspar. In terms of heavy mineral fraction, it's characterized by abundant mature heavy mineral assemblage, what we call the ZTR assemblage. And then the Llanos Basin, this extensive floodplain characterized by very high rates of chemical erosion, what we see there is almost a decimation of the more unstable minerals such as feldspars, and almost an elimination of most of the heavy mineral fraction due to the intense weathering. What does this look like in terms of a ternary diagram space? So to summarize that, I want to talk about the typical ternary diagram: quartz, feldspar, lithics. Quartz-rich rocks tend to be indicative of, again, very mature provinces, high rates of chemical erosion. You can see from this QFL plot a lot of the sandstones that have been sampled within the Llanos Basin, very close to the Llanos Basin. As I said earlier, very mature mineral assemblage. Whereas as you move away from the Llanos Basin into the mountain front, you begin to get an enrichment of lithic fragments. Again, those things are very typical of this particular domain. Heavy minerals actually show a very similar fashion. Equal to the quartz domain, we have what we call the ZTR domain territory, which is zircon, tourmaline, and rutile, which tends to be very stable heavy minerals. Whereas as you move into the more lithic-rich type fraction, characterized by more higher rates of erosion, we get a wider assemblage that may include things such as biotite surviving. So one of the assumptions that we made was that these changes in mineralogy that we can observe spatially across the region is also reflected in terms of time. So if we can recognize areas in time where we see, for example, an overprint of lithic-rich rocks or lithic-rich heavy minerals overlying more stable heavy minerals, we can automatically assume that may be due to an onset or increase in erosion associated with higher rates of deformation. So that is one of the assumptions that we made in this particular study. And the next couple slides will actually demonstrate, one, the minerals, the results of the heavy mineral analyses that we saw, and two, how we interpreted those minerals to recognize that transition from passive to active deformation in time. So what were the results of the heavy minerals study? So we return to the stratigraphic chart of Trinidad. So on the left-hand side, you see the Cenozoic stratigraphic chart starting from the Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene into Miocene, and then up into the Miocene, Pliocene. To the far left, you see the different sandstone units that were sampled for this study. And the colors on the right really represents the suite or the percentage of various heavy minerals that we identified among these sandstones. So if you look at that list, you see a number of common heavy minerals: zircon, tourmaline, rutile, actinolite, chloritoid, sillimanite. Many of you would recognize these from your undergraduate classes. Let's make a few key observations. The first observation that we make is there's a very large swath of this gray color. And this gray color identifies what I previously referred to as the ZTR assemblage, the zircon, tourmaline, rutile assemblage, which suggests a very mature heavy mineral group of rocks, and as if you recall, characterized by either very stable cratons or high rates of chemical weathering. As you look at the more colored bars, those are things such as apatite, garnet, staurolite, much more unstable, I should say, unstable mineral assemblage. And what we observe from that suite is a gradual increase in various colors, suggesting a gradual increase in the amount of unstable heavy minerals into the younger Cenozoic. So at first glance, how do we begin to interpret that? One can say immediately that as you move through the Cenozoic into younger and younger sediments, you have an increasing amount of very unstable heavy minerals. which may either due to one preservation of those minerals or maybe a secondary sediment source for these minerals. Now that change, I would argue, based on this graph, is most drastic around the River Formation, which is sort of your middle Oligocene. Here you can see a very sudden input of a very large green bar. Those are really chloritoids, a sudden influx of chloritoids into the system, and chlorite, dictated by the red bar. And then as you get into younger and younger sediments, you see strong input of chlorite in your Cruz Formation. And by the time you get into the youngest Miocene-Pliocene sands, you see strong input of things such as epidote or the epidote group. And again, chloritoids and chlorite continues into those younger sediments. So if we refer back to the previous graphs that were shared, we can begin to interpret the sudden influx or the increase in the younger, more unstable heavy mineral assemblage as possibly indicative of higher rates of erosion. One can interpret that to mean the influx of erosion, or the onset of uplift occurring in the region around the Oligocene, the late Oligocene into the Miocene time. So we will now attempt to get a bit more precise with those general observations. In doing so, we would try to relate the mineral assemblages or the individual minerals that we identified to very specific tectonic domains. And in doing so, I refer you to the table on the right. And what we have done in this table is begin to group specific groups of minerals as representative of particular domains. So for example, the ZTR suite that I referred to earlier, we're saying that that is probably indicative of a very mature, very stable parent or protolith for the sandstones, what we call here transport limited. Similarly, we look at suites of minerals that are very characteristic of metamorphic rocks, in particular the sillimanite, staurolite, garnet assemblage, and andalusite assemblage, very characteristic of more high-grade metamorphic domains. And then lastly, we have the low temperature, high pressure metamorphic suite characterized by epidote, chloritoid, chlorite, and actinolite. That suite tends to be fairly representative of more low-grade green schist type facies, which are actually fairly common around the margin today. If we transpose those assemblages onto the common ternary plot, we can begin to see the relationships in the sandstones. So on the ternary plot, we represent one to the far left. We represent what we call the Orinoco Association, which is characterized by very stable craton, very high levels of chemical weathering, very mature mineral assemblages. To the top point, we have what I call the Caribbean Mountain Suite, characterized by the low temperature, high pressure assemblage, the epidotes, the chloritoids, the chlorides. And then to the bottom right, we have the high-grade metamorphic assemblage, which would be characterized by abundant sillimanite, staurolite, garnet, etc., etc. As we begin to look at the relative percentages of these minerals, each of the rock types are now represented by symbols. And from these symbols, you see a couple trends emerge. So to the very base or the very corner of the Orinoco Association, there's a number of rocks that are not really truly represented here, but they represent an extremely mature assemblage of zircon, tourmaline, and rutile. As you move into the younger Pliocene, and in particular the late Oligocene, you see this body of red stars. And that group of rocks represents what we think is the first significant deviation away from that southern pole of very stable rocks. So we interpret that around the late Oligocene for the very first time, we see an input of a mineral assemblage that's indicative of higher erosion or higher rates of erosion, more unstable heavy minerals. And then by the Pliocene time, we see a very stark difference in the composition, where the assemblage is largely representative of the metamorphic type domains. The inference here is that the Pliocene rocks were sourced largely from low-grade metamorphic rocks. So let's begin to summarize some of those observations. And to do so, I return again to our stratigraphic column for the region. Again, I show that transition throughout the Cenozoic from the Paleogene into the Neogene, while on the x-axis you see a number of different variables, mineral variables. One, the framework fraction; two, the percentage of lithics and the type of lithics; and then the three representing the heavy mineral assemblage that we have been showing throughout this presentation. So if we focus on the heavy mineral assemblage, we see one. Around the Oligocene time, we see a sudden influx of minerals that has the effect of reducing or diminishing the amount of heavy or stable minerals that we had in the rock record. So we see a reduction in what we call the ZTR ratio, largely characterized by an influx of chloritoids and chlorite, indicative of green schist facies metamorphic rock, what we call the low-grade metamorphic suite. When we look at the lithic fraction, we see a parallel increase in the amount of metamorphic lithics we see in the sandstone fraction. And then finally, when we look at the framework fraction on the whole, we see an increase in the amount of lithic arenites relative to the quartz arenites that existed prior to the Oligocene period. Now, putting all of these together, I refer you to the map towards the base. The inference here is, during most of the Cenozoic period, that is the earlier Cenozoic, we believe a lot of the more stable minerals came from more craton sourced. Towards the later Oligocene or the later Cenozoic period, we begin to see an influx of sediment from what we think would be the uplifting Andean mountain belt. So the interpretation that we've put forward is earlier craton sourced passive margin sediments, and much later Andean source active margin sedimentation. So just quickly wrapping up, based on the heavy mineral assemblages, what we conclude is we see that transition from a passive continental margin into an active continental margin somewhere around the late Oligocene, represented by the river formation sandstones. So this was just one example of how we tend to use heavy minerals in elucidating the geological evolution of particular regions. In this case, the Trinidad region. We think it's a particularly useful tool, even more useful when integrated with a number of other data sets as shown for the study, where we use the lithofacies, the framework fraction, we use ichnofacies to determine how the margin would have evolved throughout the Cenozoic. To end, I just want to refer you to a YouTube video which partially arose out of the results of this study, where we try to show that evolution in a very, what I call a child-friendly way, cartoonized manner. So there you can actually view Trinidad as it is today. Then you can go back in time to the Cretaceous, look at that passive continental margin that I mentioned earlier, and gradually see how the margin would have evolved based on the results of that was shown today, evolved into that active continental margin, characterized by abundant uplift of the Andean mountain belt and a lot of erosion of clastic sediments. So I thank you for your time. Forgive me, probably gone a little bit over time, but I hope that at least we provided some insights into the research using heavy minerals. Thanks again for your time, everyone.